Hello everybody, and thank you for tuning in. This week we're talking about buttons, and we're talking about dating buttons. A lot of people dig all kinds of buttons, and we're going to talk about button dating today. Buttons can be dated by their material, pewter, vegetable ivory, hard rubber, pressed ceramic, or tombac. Those are examples of materials that were kind of short-lived, and so brass buttons, however, have a very long lifespan in terms of production. So pewter, vegetable ivory, things like that, those types of buttons, pressed ceramic, tombac, those we know by the construction material, the material it's made of. We can also date buttons by the specific method of production, and the Sanders type buttons, the 1-piece, 2-piece, 3-piece, and so forth, turned or spun backs, cast buttons, Prosser buttons made of pressed ceramic, and so forth. I'm also going to tell you that there's another way to date buttons, a third way. So material, construction, style attributes is the third type. So these can be designs, military buttons, sportsman's buttons, fraternal buttons, Jacksonian buttons, and then of course dating by the back mark according to the manufacturer. Okay, so I want to start with pewter buttons. Pewter buttons are interesting because they're cast in molds. And so I have an example here of a pewter button that was cast in a mold. You can see the shank is integrally cast there. It's part of the mold. You can see the hinge mark or the scissor mark for the mold, where the two sides of the mold fit together, and that was cast in a mold. Pewter was most commonly used during the American colonial period, 1700s and 1600s, because there wasn't much copper available in the United States. We did not have a copper mine, so we had to get copper to make alloys out of melting down boilers from ships, and silverware and utensils and other things. So here's another example of a pewter button. This one has a basket weave design. This one's also cast, but it's very professionally made. And you can see that nice round shank there, and you can see the basket weave pattern here on it. So that's pewter buttons. You can also find lead buttons. They're generally homemade, and so you can see that this is just a flattened piece of lead with some sew-through holes bored in. So both lead and pewter buttons often were made on site through various means by casting lead or lead pewter in molds that individuals had. So the most common buttons that we find during the colonial period and antebellum times are flat buttons, and I've got a sort of an assemblage of flat buttons here. Flat buttons are 1-piece buttons. Were worn during the colonial period and early 1800s almost exclusively by men. And they were often made in England and imported during most of the colonial period because there was some interruption of imports, of course, during the Revolution and the War of 1812. And a lot of these have some sort of marks on the back. Almost all of the fronts of these were either plated with silver or gilded. Silver-plated ones generally I associate with the late 1700s or very early 1800s, and they're generally of the same time period as tombac buttons, which look like these. These are tombac alloy, white tombac, and they often have an appearance on the back like they're spun on a lathe-like a device to kind of turn the back. You can kind of see that on that big example there. Okay, so the same kind of color, that white color, was very popular. These would have been very kind of shiny white colored like that. When you see a flat button that's silver gilded, it's generally about the same time period as those tombac buttons circulated. At any rate, and the normal flat button or 1-piece button, these were stamped out of sheets of rolled out metal. It was rolled out in a mill usually with giant rollers and then cut. And so what you'll see is lots of quality marks. These are marks that just indicate like double gilt, imperial standard, London color, treble gilt, orange gilt, best quality, and so forth. They just use all combinations of those back marks. And again, they're just quality marks. They're not actual manufacturer's marks. When you see an OUR, like on this bottom example here, London, and then color, COLOUR, that's a British spelling. Most of these buttons were imported until U.S. button manufacturing started to be in its heyday in the 1820s and 30s, and we started to have the golden age of American button manufacturer. FYI, a lot of times you'll see buttons that have an eagle on the back mark. You can see the small eagle at the top of the back mark on both of these imported buttons, and this happened right after the War of 1812. The British imported a lot of these that had an American eagle on them to kind of play on American patriotism and zeal in the American market. So that's kind of interesting. 1820s, we'd started into the golden age of button manufacture in the United States, and we started to see some domed convex buttons. Here's an excavated example, but I'm going to show you some other examples as well of domed convex buttons. This one keeps a lot of the gold gilding on it. Just FYI, a lot of these were fire gilded. So they had mercury that was dissolved, gold that was dissolved into a mercury solution, and then dipped on the button or painted on the button, and then the mercury was burned off. And a lot of times, even with the chasing and finishing and grinding of blanks, button blanks and planchets and so forth, it was women doing a lot of this work. And so, of course, the effects of like vaporizing mercury were pretty awful health effects. It kind of reminds you of the Fossey Jaw girls who were making the matchsticks in the 1800s. At any rate, so a lot of this happened by hand. So you get hand chasing, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And you get buttons that are actually unique because they're finished in different ways by hand. So there's an example of one of the domed buttons, which is kind of interesting. And again, this is tied to the golden age of American button production. You start to see these in 1820s and 30s, and the golden age really goes from about 1820 to 1850 or so. And it applies not only to one-piece buttons like this, but also beautiful two-piece buttons. And here's a beautiful two-piece button. Still retains some of its gold gilding, has a leaf design of some sort, and it's Leavenworth and Company. So that's a golden age button from probably the 1850s or so. And of course, this chasing here, you can see those indentations that are made after the button was already finished. Those indentations are made with a blunt tool that's called chasing. So it's kind of interesting. When we're talking about flat buttons, the earlier style of button, there's a way to date those according to the shanks. Alpha shanks, omega shanks, and various different shank types will tell you the age of those buttons, even if there's no other identifying marks. So I'm going to put a resource down below in the description that's going to show you exactly what those various shank types are. It's a great resource from the DAACS, and you can go check that out. It's a PDF. Just click the link in the description and read that. It's kind of interesting. Moving on, of course, I had already shown this button earlier. This is, of course, a two-piece button. Okay, so that has a rim, or an outer part, top rather, and a bottom. And those two are kind of put one over each other, okay? And that is according to the Sanders type of button manufacturing. And that Sanders type is, that's basically the method used for all two-piece buttons, aside from buttons that have an applied rim, which we'll talk about in a second. And that's named for the patent process of rolling the front over the back of each button in order to attach the front to the back without having to braze it on. Just FYI, a lot of ball buttons that I see, some of those look like they're produced with the Sanders method. Here's some ball buttons. And some of them actually, this one has the back inside of it. Some of them actually look like they were brazed on. So when you see ball buttons, you see sometimes a variety of different attachment methods for those. Ball buttons are not necessarily Zouave buttons. They are just civilian buttons in most cases, unless they're recovered in military sites. So there's many different types of these buttons that are two-piece, and there's many subtypes. And one of the subtypes is actually a one-piece button with an applied rim. And that's called a Jacksonian button. So you can see there's a groove there around that. It says Scoville Extra. Okay, this is a Jacksonian button, and it has the rim applied to the flat button with the design. And I'm going to show a couple more of these Jacksonian buttons. They were made from about 1825 to about 1840 or so. And they are not military, they're civilian, and they look like little miniature pictures in frames with the rim almost acting like a frame, and lots of different designs possible. So it's kind of an interesting subgenre of buttons to collect. And again, they're like a one-piece with an applied rim, so they're technically a two-piece button. Okay, so in addition to two-piece buttons, there's also three-piece buttons. And of course, I had said earlier that a Jacksonian button was really a one-piece button with an applied rim. Well, a two-piece button, instead of taking the rim and cutting it, like tucking it under itself in the Sanders type process, there's a three-piece button where you basically connect the two with an applied rim, front and back and applied rim. And so this is a three-piece button. It's generally called a staff type button by button collectors. And these types of buttons were generally for military staff officers, and they were used, various state seal buttons have this type of construction with the three pieces. So used for military officership, but also used by fraternal organizations such as this organization, Knights of Pythias, to reference the military origins or officership of their membership or their beliefs. And so you'll see these three-piece buttons used in fraternal buttons, three-piece construction as well. And also you'll see them used for veterans organizations like the GAR, the SCV, the SUV, Sons of Veterans, Sons of Confederate Veterans, Sons of Union Veterans, which of course have military ties. Okay, so that's an interesting other type of button here is the three-piece construction. Okay, so there are several main different types of two-piece buttons, subgenres of them, and there are some good resources to identify many of them. And really quickly, those subgenres are military buttons, sportsman's buttons, fraternal buttons, transportation buttons, and livery buttons. So military buttons have their own collecting subgenre, and there's three main resources plus an additional overarching resource for those. The first one is the overarching resource, which is the Albert's Button Book, which has been around a very long time. You can pick up one in any edition. They're all basically the same. Here is shown the Centennial Edition, and it covers buttons from the American Revolution up through the 20th century. So that's an overarching but not as in-depth resource. The second resource is the Military Buttons of the American Revolution by Don Troiani, which is a phenomenal book. It's kind of hard to get. And that is a great resource for exactly what it says, Buttons of the American Revolution. Then there is a second book that covers the years after the American Revolution up until the 1830s, mid-1830s, which is American Military Buttons, an Interpretive Study by Bruce Bazelon and William Lay. Brand new book. Get it while you can is my advice, because it will sell out and become unaffordable. And it covers military buttons during those years. And then the third one is the Tice book, which really focuses on the buttons that were used during the Civil War, both manufactured and also saw service, a little earlier militia buttons, 1840s and 50s buttons and so forth. So those are the main three. You also have sportsman's buttons, and these are buttons which were worn on sporting coats, generally 1830s, 40s. A lot of them were produced by Wadham's manufacturing company. You have fraternal buttons, and fraternal buttons are a subtype of button where you have fraternal orders, like this one is Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks button, two-piece button there, late 1800s button. You have the golden age of fraternalism where a lot of these types of things cropped up. Here's Woodman of the World and so forth. These are non-excavated examples here. You have transportation buttons, and those there's some resources there for you on transportation buttons. That includes railroad, steamship, and trolley, among other modes of transportation. Their uniformed folks who operated those conveyances had buttons that said what they were, or what cruise ship line or what railroad they were with. You also have livery buttons, which are for uniformed employees of various organizations. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this. I'm actually got a second video coming out with a lot more information about all the other types of buttons. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, and I'll see you all next week.